A very warm welcome to everyone, and it's beautiful to see the geographic spread of people attending this. Of course, we wouldn't be able to do this, in real if things went as they are now. So, if you're sitting comfortably, let's get our evening started. Yeah, our evening's conversation started. As you all know, and as we no longer need to debate, the Earth, our Earth, is in trouble. The
Yeah,
climate,
recommended a bigger one.
so, okay. The climate, the climate emergency is unfolding all around us. Just in the last couple of weeks, the chief executive of the Environment Agency warned that the climate emergency is already hitting worst case scenario levels, which, if left unchecked, will lead to the collapse of ecosystems. Arctic ice melt now means that polar bears are having to use 4 times as much energy just to survive. And the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which is the circulation system that underpins the Gulf Stream, which brings warm and mild weather to Europe, is, researchers announced, at its weakest in more than 1,000 years, with climate change being the most likely explanation. The list of visible impacts, from forest fires to droughts to sea levels rise and far beyond, grows longer and more terrifying by the day. So, this evening, as part of our What Is Week, isn't so much about leaping to solutions, although there will be a bit of that. Rather, what we want to do is to support each other in getting as clear a sense as we can of where we are now. What is the state of science? Is it too late? What can still be done? And what are the most impactful routes imaginable to getting those things done? How best can we invest our energy, our resources, our activism, and how better to work together? We are joined by four amazing, and I repeat, amazing guests for this evening. First of all, we have Sam Knight, who is a writer, actor, and climate activist. He is currently writing a sitcom about the climate movement, and has previously starred in Jojo Rabbit, directed by Taika Waititi, and The French Dispatch, directed by Wes Anderson. In 2019, he coordinated the political negotiation strategy of Extinction Rebellion, which resulted in the UK Parliament declaring a climate emergency. Sam also edited This Is Not a Drill, published by Penguin Books. And next, we will have Lola Fayukun, who is a young climate campaigner. She is heavily involved with the UK Student Climate Network, the grassroots network which hosts the youth climate strikes in the UK. Her role with the network has seen her involvement in the organization and delivery of Britain's largest climate protest in history, as well as several education projects and collaborative actions with groups such as Greenpeace and Green New Deal UK. Her work is centered around promoting an anti-racist vision of climate justice. And third, soon to join us will be Dr. Michael E. Mann, who will be joining us for the central hour of this webinar. And Dr. Mann was a lead author on the Observe Climate Variability and Change chapter of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Third scientific assessment report in 2001, and was organizing committee chair for the National Academy of Sciences Frontiers of Science in 2003. He has received a number of accolades and awards, far too many for me to mention here, but wow, and contributed with other IPCC authors to the award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. He was elected to the US National Academy of Sciences in 2020, and he is also a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, the Geological Society of America, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. He is also a co-founder of the award-winning science website, realclimate.org, and he is author of more than 200 peer-reviewed and edited publications, numerous op-eds and commentaries, and 5 books, most recently, The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. And lastly, we have Dr. Anna Bullen, who is the Innovation Lab Manager at the Center for Alternative Technology. The Zero Carbon Britain Hub and Innovation Lab exists to support councils, communities, and other organizations to act on the climate emergency by reducing carbon emissions and increasing resilience to climate change. The Innovation Lab brings key stakeholders together to create and prototype innovative solutions that will overcome barriers to reaching net zero, increase resilience to climate change, and contribute to systemic change. Anna is an experienced and qualified facilitator and project manager with 25 years of experience working in the sustainability arena. She is passionate about bringing people together to deliver sustainable solutions that address the climate emergency. She is a firm believer in the use of co-creation methods in order to design effective and meaningful solutions to complex issues such as those that we are faced with. Prior to joining CAT, she was partner at CAG Consultants, where she led many collaborative projects for a variety of clients, including WWF, JNCC, Power to Change, and multiple councils across the UK. She has an academic background with a degree in environmental management and resource development. She has an MA in space, place, and politics, and a PhD in sustainable citizenship. Whew, what an amazing panel, right? If this was actually a real event in a hall, I would ask for a round of applause to welcome our panel on stage. Clearly, we can't do that. So, at the risk of total chaos, we're going to unmute all the microphones just for a few seconds so you can make some noise to show your appreciation and welcome our beautiful guests. Please go ahead.
Yay!
Beautiful. I'll now hand over to my dear brother Roll.
Oops.
Okay. So thank you, Nick. We're going to now hand over to our panel, and we're going to start with Sam Knights. So Sam did a great one-man show reflecting on his experiences in Extinction Rebellion at Edinburgh Festival 2 years ago, I think it was, you know, when we could still do such things. It was brilliant. So Sam, we'd love to hear your reflections on our theme for this evening. Could you share any key experiences in your work trying to save the climate? How was it for you? What did you learn? What are your reflections on what we need to do now? How do you see the current state of the climate resistance rebellion? You have 10 minutes, Sam. Over to you.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Nick. And it's lovely to be speaking to everybody today. I wanted to kind of base most of my reflections around the idea of success and failure, because I think a lot of us have had a lot of time over the last year or so to just sit with what is success and what is failure. And there is certainly a feeling in the groups that I've been organizing with and the movements I've been a part of things disintegrating around us at the moment. And maybe that's a kind of false feeling, exacerbated by the pandemic, but I think there are deeper roots there, and I think it's worth digging in. In order to access that, I think maybe the easiest way for me to do that is just to explain to you the journey I went on in 2018-19, as Rob was talking about. And it starts with a confession, which is that I'm really new to this. and I basically had my ecological epiphany, stroke breakdown, in 2018 when the special report on global warming came out, the IPCC, which quite literally, I think, changed the world and changed the status of the climate movement. I remember sitting in my bed and thinking, you know, what am I going to do about this? I read as much as I could, and I researched as much as I could, and I eventually found a tiny group called Extinction Rebellion, who, you know, at the time had fewer Twitter followers than my mum, and yet they were, to me at least, offering the only sort of coherent and proportionate response to this crisis, which was mass civil disobedience. It was only radicalism and on that level that I felt was a proportionate response. So I ended up organizing my first protest with them, which was the Declaration of Rebellion, which I'm sure many of you were at, and totally took many of us by surprise, I think. I remember really vividly walking up the stairs of Westminster Tube Station and seeing 1,000 people in Parliament Square and suddenly realizing that this was a movement, right? That this wasn't just something that 10 or 15 people were doing in their bedrooms, but it was a movement on the street, and this was prefiguring a change that was to come. And then one thing led to another, and we organized protest after protest after protest, and the movement built and built and built. And I think by the Six Bridges protest, which was only a month later, the movement was 7,000 strong. And then eventually we worked up to the April Rebellion in 2019, which again, I'm sure many of you were at or saw pictures of or were aware of somewhere in the consciousness. And it felt amazing. I mean, it was one of the best and worst weeks of my life, actually, because it kind of encapsulated that beautiful, rebellious, anarchic spirit of Carnival. And it felt like we'd really achieved something. And as many of you will know, the day after we called an end to the rebellion, the UK Parliament became the first country in the world to declare a climate emergency. And I again remember standing in Parliament Square and seeing the coalition of groups that were there and thinking that the climate movement was totally unbeatable. And since then, I think we've had a much more deeper experience of failure. And I think that failure has run across movements. You know, for those of us who are also on the left of politics, that failure is tied, I think, to the failure of Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. And it sometimes feels at the moment that the window for radical change is shrinking. So I wanted to sit with that, and I wanted to sit with how successful have we been. And I think by kind of like, you know, the normal measures to these things, we might look at the polls. And the polls are encouraging. 81% of people in the UK now think that climate change is an emergency, right? If you'd said that 3 years ago, I think we would have all said that you were crazy. That change has happened so rapidly and it's happened so quickly. And I think it has happened in part, and maybe this is sort of, you know, overconfidence on our part, but I think it has happened in part because of the actions of Extinction Rebellion and other direct action groups, other activist groups really pushing for that change. But there are other polls that tell a very different picture, and polls are probably not the best way of working out what success and failure looks like. While kind of thinking about this event, I was reading A Dream of John Bull by William Morris, and at one point the main character sort of stops and reflects, and he says, "I pondered all these things and how men fight and lose the battle, and the thing that they fought for comes about in spite of their defeat, and when it comes turns out not to be what they meant, and other men have to fight for what they meant under another name." And I think that kind of weird confusion of how change happens is an important thing to bear in mind when we talk about the success and failure of movements. I was also reading a book called The Radical Imagination, which is written by Max Haven and Alex Kaznabich. And they say this: We turn to social movements not merely because they offer a means to transform our world, but also because they offer a means of coping with a world of relentless and cascading humanitarian, ecological, social, and political tragedy. Movements not only offer an ideological outlet, they offer a form of community and a source of support for identity in a world driven by impossible demands. This is true both of immersive movements that claim the whole subject and more casual and flexible movements. They promise to be places where both individuals and communities can recreate themselves and find support for doing so, so at least partially outside the dictates of capital's reproduction. If movements are to reproduce themselves effectively and win the victories they desire, they must attend to this crisis. Part of this, we suggest, has to do with reimagining the meaning of success and failure. I mean, in other words, right, that we can't just think about the declaration of climate emergency as the only success of a group like Extinction Rebellion. And they've got a kind of funny graph in their book. I don't know whether people can see this, but it kind of was interesting to stumble upon it today, because in many ways that's the Extinction Rebellion symbol. And what they do is try and map out how to measure success and failure from a social movement perspective. And they have on one axis success, failure, not success, which is a slightly odd way of thinking about things, but they're arguing that success is defined by the culture in which you live. And any radical movement will be trying to complicate the idea of what success is. So you have to think about success, not success, failure, not failure. And then they talk about things coming off that, like collective potential, burnout, gains, culture. I think what that kind of muddled graph tells me is that it's incredibly hard to think about success and failure in social movements. And academics probably aren't the best people to do so anyway. But with Extinction Rebellion, I think what we saw, and this was married in loads of different climate groups in 2019, was a tangible success, which then sort of ironically led to a decline, led to a failure, led to a splintering. The movement descended into infighting. People were pushed out. Huge issues came to the fore. And I'm running out of time, so I think what I'll do, instead of sort of making a case for exactly what should come next, is raise the question of why that happened. And I think there were many problems with our movement, and they've been well documented and fought over, and, you know, hopefully we'll discuss a lot of them here. And there's no point me kind of relitigating all of them now. But what they sort of fundamentally boiled down to was a lack of sort of democracy, a lack of strategy, and a lack of vision. And I wrote a blog post in 2019 when I burnt out of the movement, recommending 6 things which I still think, unfortunately, Extinction Rebellion would benefit from implementing. The first was to adopt a 4th demand on climate justice. The second was to democratize the movement. The third was to end the reductive messaging around prison and the police. The 4th was to start political education programs, to share knowledge. The 5th was to work with other groups and show solidarity. And the 6th was to breathe, to pause and discuss and what should happen next. And that 6th one was so important, it didn't happen. And as a result, the movement floundered. And I think at the heart of all of those is a desire for a plan, a desire for what happens next, a desire for a politics, because there is only so far you can continue shouting that this is an emergency before people ask you, what next, right? What next? I mean, Extinction Rebellion, we often used to describe ourselves as a fire alarm, right? Well, when a fire alarm goes off, that's all very well and good. And we've done that now. 81% of people believe that this is a climate emergency. But when a fire alarm goes off, you then want people to point you to where the fire exits are. And that's what we need to do now. As a climate movement, as a wider system of justice movements, we need to stand up, step into our power, and start thinking about what the future looks like, spelling out a radical vision of that future, and not being afraid to say that, of course, that's political. There's no such thing as beyond politics. It doesn't exist. And what we see when we have a movement which resists politics, which is anti-politics in many sense, is that it doesn't have that heart, that sustainability to last. And when it can't last, that's when you get the fractures. And I think we're in a really interesting moment in the climate movement. I really, really think that if these movements change now, we have the capacity still to be unbeatable, to still do immense, profound good. But movements like Extinction Rebellion also, if they continue on their current course, will fade into irrelevance, and other movements will come along, but maybe it'll be too late by then. I'm really looking forward to speaking about this with all of you more, and I'll stop there. Thanks, Rob.
Wow, 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 wow. Thank you so much, Sam. You've given us so much food for thought. Brilliant. And, I've taken so many notes during your presentation, and, so much to talk about. And you're so right about so many things. Personally, I also joined Extinction Rebellion during the April 2019 rebellion and so on. And just I'll highlight one thing you said, and that is, I've often said that movements, social movements, environmental movements, etc., tend to be thermostats. So they tell us what is about to happen. So whilst politicians are, they use their thermometers to gauge the temperature of what is happening before they declare what their true deepest convictions are, and they use the thermometer through opinion polls and so on and so forth before they declare that. Social movements are out on the streets and so on. And I think in reaction to, very quickly before we move on, reaction to what quite a big gist of what you said is that groups like this, the Transition Network, we're solutions-based, so we're trying to offer solutions to the problems that are out there, problems that seem too big, to face. We're advocating for community-based solutions, and I think joining, the rage against the machinations with the solutions-based, this is where we can prosper. So thank you so much, Sam. That was wonderful, and I look forward to the conversation we have afterwards. Thank you once again. So, our next speaker, I'm so happy to welcome again, Lola Fayekun, who once wrote, and I love this, that we have a once in a lifetime opportunity to get this right. Bear with me one moment. Sorry, we have a once in a lifetime opportunity to get this right. Right doesn't mean emissions reductions. Right means creating a new prosperous world for all, one in which our economies have been restructured along social and environmental principles to ensure everybody has a good quality of life, no matter where in the world you were born or where in the world you are. Right means taking responsibility, changing our ways, and acting out of solidarity rather than for personal gain. Young people in the UK are leading the way with this call. We are able to shout the loudest, and it's time those in positions of power start properly listening. Lola, welcome, welcome, welcome. We would love to hear your reflections on your experiences with the youth climate movement. Rather than a presentation, you wanted to use your time more sort of in conversation with us. So if you don't mind, if I may perhaps start with a question. What do you feel you have learned from your time involved in the youth climate movement, Lola?
Thanks so much for that introduction. And Sam, you said you took notes. I wish I'd taken notes because there was just so much there, and I feel like I was trying to hold it all in my head, and it's almost impossible. So in response to that question, I think it's interesting because there's a lot of work being done now on climate education and stuff about climate being taught to people in schools and that kind of thing. That's a real emerging issue at the moment in terms of where young people's energy is going. But I feel like in terms of how I learned pretty much everything I know about climate and society, I learned it through actually doing social action work, and I learned it in the grassroots, not in a classroom. I feel like, you know, I had a conception of the issue, but it obviously was incredibly underdeveloped. You know, we're a generation that learned about climate change in school. You know, I studied it, but it was framed as something which was a future issue. That you know, I remember being told that my children's children's children would live through climate change. You know, when in reality, at that very moment, there were people facing the disastrous impacts of climate change, and that was an issue that was ignored. So I knew about climate change, but not in a way which actually addressed its systemic nature, not in a way which really highlighted its impacts and the extent of those impacts and the you know, immediate nature of those impacts. So in terms of what I really learned from being a part of this movement, it was that systemic thinking. It was that you know, the fact that climate change isn't just a single issue, it's an issue which is connected with every single issue in our social fabric. And I also learned what it means to try to take action and how that can work. And I learned about my own power as a young person and my skills, and I learned where they lied and how to develop them. And I think that all of those are really essential things that I was able to learn. And I didn't, as I said, I didn't learn them in school. I learned them in community with other people, learning from people my age and younger and older, people from all different backgrounds across the country and across the world. And I think that that was a really incredible way to learn. So while fighting for the climate change education in the classroom is really important, I also think there's so much to be learned by doing. And there are a lot of young people who are learning in that kind of way and who are being educated. That is education in itself. You know, that is learning in itself, and it's incredibly valuable. And I'm so lucky to have had that experience.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes, and as you've pointed out, learning in community, I think is key to growing not just the transition movement, but solving a lot of these issues. And of course, it's interesting that you talked about the state of the climate movement in general, and Sam, you know, which references Sam talking about the fracturing of XR and perhaps the hinge point that environmental movements find ourselves at this moment in time. Of course, thank you so much for talking about or for highlighting the fact that climate change is connected to every single issue. It really is. It really is. And I noticed someone put in the chat that we need to embrace this idea of systems thinking. My next question for you perhaps then would be, what would you say is the current state of the movement? Again, as I said, Sam has talked a bit about fracturing within XR, for example. What is the current state perhaps of the youth climate movement?
Yeah, so in terms of the youth climate movement, I think it's definitely been fractured. You know, I think it's similar to think. It's interesting to think about the similarities and differences between you know, what Sam tracked with XR and my experience in the youth climate movement. You know, I think there is this feeling that 2019 was kind of this almost like a golden hour. It felt like, oh, it just felt like, you know, I think back to those days and it just felt like the world was on the precipice, you know, and everyone, we kind of held everything in our hands. And it was just a really, really wild time in that sense. And I think that, you know, 2020, obviously coronavirus happened, but before that, you know, we were already having to deal with substantial issues. And I agree in terms of the issues that Sam highlighted. I think there are others as well. I think I don't really think they have been litigated as much as they should be. I think there's still a lot of work for us to do in terms of actually identifying what the issues were and how we can address them. But I think that in terms of the key ones I've experienced in the UK Student Climate Network, which hosted the climate strikes, there were a lot of issues around capacity. And I think there's in a lot of different movements that it's often the same people who end up having to do the work. And a lot of the time, those people who are actually doing work behind the scenes can be women, people from marginalized backgrounds, and it often comes down to the same kind of people to keep doing that. And we weren't really doing a lot of work of really, yeah, exactly, unpaid work. And, you know, obviously being young people, we didn't really have that. We were just a bunch of young people working for free. And we did find a lot of the time that we were exploited in that sense. We were easily exploited because we were essentially a bunch of teenagers who didn't have a clue about how anything worked. So, you know, I have friends who would go and do events and all these different types of things and be asked to do a lot of work and support with a lot of different things. But they obviously none of that was compensated. And so we actually ended up spending a lot of our money to be a part of this movement. And obviously that has implications in terms of who's able to be in part of the movement, who's able to spend that money and do that time, we had systems where you'd be reimbursed, but obviously that means you have to have the money up front if you can be reimbursed. So that obviously starts raising a lot of issues. I agree with things in terms of, strategy, the strategy just wasn't there. And diversity was a really big issue. I think that it's all well and good that we wanted to bring everyone together, but at the same time, if climate is a systemic issue, if people can care about climate, but see it in very, very different ways. And I think that we were all on the same page about the fact that climate change was real and it was an issue, but the nature of climate denial has shifted. Climate denial isn't just saying that, climate change doesn't exist. It's arguing about, it's in the fine print now. It's about, what action needs to be taken and when, who are positive actors in this space. And I think that we weren't all on the same page about what we were really fighting for in that sense. And we should have done the work of actually establishing, what we were on the same page about, where the common ground was, and understanding that a lot of us felt like we were talking about the same things, but we really weren't. So I think that in terms of where we are now, it's about thinking a lot more deeply about those issues. And in this time where we're in a bit of a lull, starting to look towards the future where we can confront those issues that we've been dealing with over the past couple of years.
Beautiful. Very quickly before I pass over to Rob to ask you a couple of questions. 2019 Precipice, absolutely brilliant, yes, and we got some very, very what I call hollow victories in terms of the Parliament declaring the climate emergency and so on. And it's just amazing that we find ourselves at this point. And I think this pause that we've been forced to face gives us time to reflect. As Samuel Beckett said, ever tried, ever failed, fail again, try again, fail again, fail better. So we, regroup and try again is the advice I would give to the youth climate movements. Brother Rob, any questions for
Halo? Yeah, I wanted to ask how you, picking up on something Sam was talking about at the end there, about how you see the overlap between the youth climate movement and the movements that are working to try and build the world that comes next. Do you see much overlap between those two things, or do they feel like very distinct, different movements?
I feel like in terms of how we see ourselves and how we've always tried to position ourselves, we really do believe that what we're fighting for is that world that comes next. Climate justice is something that's always been at the heart of what we're fighting for and arguing for. And I think it's interesting the way that as young people, it's interesting our relationship with the media, which is something that I didn't pick up on when I was talking about what I think the issues were, but it's something which is really integral, in my opinion, which is that it's the way that we've been presented and the way which it was easiest and most convenient for us to be presented was that, we are young people fighting for our futures, which is true, but it's kind of reductive. We're not just fighting, as I said, we're not just fighting for lower carbon emissions for a day, 30, 40, 50 years from now. We're fighting for people across the world who are suffering right now due to the implications of climate change. And we are fighting because we understand that the UK has a historic responsibility based on its status as a global leader in terms of causing climate change to be a global leader in terms of actually, dealing with the implications of it and starting us on a path to progress. And we don't see that as one particular thing that we work on. We see it as, in terms of how I see it as climate is just everything, and I feel like sometimes it's difficult to communicate that because it's something that I've learned, and so it's so ingrained, but it's that I look at climate and I see housing and the economy and feminism and racism, and I see everything. And so it's like, that's the way that we're confronting it, and that's how we see it, is that, this is not, we are in community with every single issue for every single campaign for social justice. And we do sometimes do solidarity actions around this. I'm from London, so I'm in UKSDN London. And when we decided to, I think a year ago or so, we decided for our banner to be youth strikers say fuck the Home Office, which was quite controversial even within the youth climate strike movement. But this was around the time of forced deportations and all of this, and we saw it as really, really crucial to come out and say that we are fighting for social justice, because it's a system based on people before profit, profit before people, and all of this that's got us into this mess. And we don't believe that we can or should try to get ourselves out of this mess without actually dealing with the fundamental things which have got us here. So,
Lola, thank you so much. We will return to all of our speakers as the evening goes on, but for now, thank you, Lola, so much for being here this evening and sharing what you've shared with us. Thank you. So we're honoured now to welcome Michael Mann to the What Next Summit. Michael possibly does more work than anyone else in the US, in particular in raising public understanding of climate breakdown and in challenging climate denial, and has the scars to show for it. His new book, The New Climate War, takes the heat to the denial industry that has done so much damage, slowing down action on climate change. Michael, we are delighted to have you with us. Might you be able to give us a kind of a state of the science update? Where are we at? Is it too late? How would you describe the scale of what we need to do, and what for you looks like the most promising pathway and mobilization to get us there? Michael, over to you.
There we go, unmuted. Thanks so much, Rob. Thanks for the kind invitation to participate in this event, and to the other members of the summit team. I will try to give sort of an assessment of where we stand when it comes to our efforts to deal with the climate crisis, including both the scientific elements and some of the policy elements as well. And in so doing, I'll actually build on some of the comments that Lola and Sam both made earlier. I think you'll see there's a synergy in sort of the message that I have to offer and what we've already heard from others here. The only display item, the only visual that I will use is my gratuitous display of my new book, The New Climate War. And the reason I wrote this book was actually very much for the reasons that Lola just sort of alluded to, that we have sort of evolved in where we stand in this battle to address the climate crisis. Outright climate change denialism is on the wane, because it just isn't credible to deny something that people can see with their own two eyes. So as we see sort of the slow but certain death of outright denial of the basic evidence of climate change, we are nonetheless seeing insidious tactics that are still intended to keep us addicted to fossil fuels, because ultimately the inactivists, as I call them in the book, the forces of inaction, the fossil fuel industry, conservative news outlets, politicians who do their bidding, they don't care about the path that we take. They just care about the destination. They want us disengaged. And they don't care whether that's because we deny the basic scientific evidence, or because we, for example, think it's too late to actually do anything about the problem. And so the book sort of describes those tactics, the various tactics that are being used to thwart our efforts to finally do something about the problem. And I won't go into the details of that, other than to say that the bottom line message of the book, and my message to all audiences today, is that there is both urgency and there is agency. We need to act now, but there is still time to act. And so let me sort of attack both of those pieces simultaneously. The urgency. Well, again, you know, we can see the impacts of climate change playing out in real time. Almost with every study that comes out, we're actually learning that we're farther along than we thought we would be down the path of climate devastation at this point, you know, based on, say, where climate models were 10 years ago. And some of you, if you're following the news cycle, you probably saw this study earlier this week about the so-called conveyor belt ocean circulation pattern. This has implications for European climate, this warm ocean current that travels northward towards Europe and warms the waters of the subpolar North Atlantic and off the coast of Europe. And that ocean circulation pattern appears to be collapsing now. It appears to be slowing down dramatically. The climate models predicted this would happen, but not for another 50 or 60 years. And part of why we think this is happening now is that the Greenland ice sheet is losing ice earlier than the models predicted it would. And so all that fresh water is running into the North Atlantic, and it's putting sort of a lens of less dense water. Fresh water is less dense than salty water. So it sort of stabilizes those surface waters in the North Atlantic and prevents the sinking motion that drives that so-called conveyor belt. But that also means that we're seeing sea level rise ahead of schedule, because that meltwater, that glacial meltwater, once again, is running off into the oceans earlier than we expected. And so, if anything, climate scientists like myself have been too conservative in our projections. We are seeing many of the impacts play out ahead of schedule, and greater amplitude, greater magnitudes of change than we predicted, say, just a decade ago. So there's the urgency. If anything, we've understated the problem. That having been said, it's important not to overstate it. And there are, examples. And Extinction Rebellion, I applaud their efforts. I think it's absolutely essential. I think their efforts and the efforts of Greta Thunberg and the youth climate movement have really helped recenter this conversation where it needed to be. It can't just be about the science and the economics and the policy and the politics. It has to be about the ethics, the intergenerational ethics of this problem. We have an ethical obligation not to destroy this planet for future generations, but also the regional inequities, where those who had the least role in creating the problem, less developed economies, are actually likely to see the worst impacts, and they have the least resilience. And so I think that it's essential that we drive home the fundamental ethical message here. Now, that having been said, one of the things I warn about in the book is that there have been some who have been led sort of down the path of doom. It's too late to do anything about the problem. And if you really think it's too late to do anything about the problem, that potentially leads you down that same path of disengagement as outright denial of the evidence. So we have to make sure that people don't become victims of doom and despair to the point where they disengage and don't demand the policy actions that we need to see, because then the inactivists win. And I think that they have been fanning the flames of sort of doomism in some cases. That having been said, most of the folks who have fallen into doom and despair are folks, well-meaning and good-hearted, and have genuinely been misled by, for example, narratives that are not faithful to the science. And one of the narratives that underlies this idea that it's too late to do anything about the problem, and I'm sure you guys have heard sort of some of this terminology: exponential climate change, runaway warming, methane bombs, this idea that we've already unleashed sort of methane trapped in the Arctic, so much of it that it'll warm the planet beyond any livable levels. There just isn't scientific evidence for that. We've been measuring the methane. We've been looking very closely at these processes. There's no evidence for a runaway methane feedback. There's no evidence for runaway warming. The climate models don't show any evidence for it. The observations don't show any evidence for it. And in fact, there is a buildup in methane concentrations, but we can actually look at the chemical fingerprint of where that methane is coming from. It's not coming from some unstoppable burp of methane from the Arctic. It's coming from fracking and natural gas extraction. The isotopic evidence tells us that that's where it's coming from. So ironically, what we see with methane has exactly the opposite implications of those who would say it's a runaway methane feedback, we can't stop it. Actually, it's coming from practices that we can stop. Our continued dependence on fossil fuels, and in this case on natural gas, which releases this methane into the atmosphere, which is a very potent warming agent and warms things even more. So the bottom line is most of those doomist narratives, and you see that almost in every doomist narrative, and I've taken to task, for example, the Deep Adaptation article that many of you would be familiar with. If you read that article, it's not a peer-reviewed scientific article, but it is premised on this idea of an unstoppable methane bomb that is playing out. And there just isn't evidence for that. And to the extent that many of these doomist narratives are predicated on these scenarios, we're really leading people astray. It isn't just that doom leads us towards disengagement, but doom, prognostications of doom based on distortions of the science are almost as bad as the distortions of the science on the other side among denialists who would have us believe there's no problem. Whether you would have us believe there's no problem at all, or that the problem has reached proportions where we can't do anything about it. Once again, that potentially leads us towards disengagement, and we're not on the front lines demanding action. So we have to make sure that folks within Extinction Rebellion, the youth climate advocates, that they don't fall victim to that framing, because we need their activism. We need them out there doing what they're doing. It's really changing the game. In the book, I attribute much of the progress we're making to those efforts, to those social movements now on climate. But we can't allow those folks to get stuck in doom. If they need to go through that phase, if they need to come to terms with their sense of dread and doom on their path towards engagement, well, then let's help them through that stage and make sure that they're not disengaged, but that they're out there on the front lines demanding action by our policymakers. And I will leave it there.
Michael, thank you so much. Wonderful. Nick.
Wow. Thank you so much, Michael. And I'll just quote something I think Bertrand Russell, it was, who said, doom is a useless emotion. So it is something that we really should try to abide by. And in fact, as a movement, transition tries to focus on the positive, on the agency within people and communities. And this is exactly what I think makes transition as a movement quite unique. Yes, so whilst the youth climate campaigners are outraging against the machinations of the system, whilst XR is also out doing the same, we are perhaps performing a bit under the radar and trying to find solutions that reflect what Buckminster Fuller said, it's no use just fighting against the system, build alternative models that make the existing system seem obsolete. So that is what we are doing. Thank you so, so much, Michael, and it's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you. Right, so, perhaps if you just take a second or two to catch your breath. I mean, this is fantastic, absolutely fantastic lineup. Thank you all so much so far. And last but by no means the least, we have Dr. Anna Bullen from Zero Carbon Britain. Anna, I wonder if you might reflect on what Zero Carbon Britain's extensive research tells us about what we could still create from this point. What is Zero Carbon Britain's extensive research telling us, or what is its vision, and how possible are its findings? What stands in the way of its implementation, and where would you say we are today in terms of our journey towards a Zero Carbon Britain? Over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Nick. And yeah, likewise, thank you for having me. And it's an honor to sit alongside, not quite alongside, but virtually alongside some fantastic panelists. It's always slightly daunting being the last one, because I've sat and listened to all of theirs and thought, oh my God, they're all amazing. And now I've got to go. Anyway, I am going to share my screen with you because I do have some slides. That was taken during the golden hour, Lola. That's my daughter in the middle there. Let me just put this on slideshow. Can you see that? Okay. Can somebody wave at me? Thank you. Okay. Oh, yeah, it's done it for me. I'm going to dive straight in because I don't have a huge amount of time to cover a lot of material. Very quickly, at CAT, we've spent the last 14 years undertaking extensive research and modelling to develop a scenario of a zero carbon Britain. The researchers produced a series of reports, all available to download for free. This is a snapshot of them. You can download them from our website. But it's the 2019 report, Rising to the Climate Emergency, that sets out a clear scenario for a zero carbon Britain built on this modelling that we've done. And I'm going to take you on a very quick whistle-stop tour of that report tonight. 10 years of research and modelling in about 10 minutes. So what could possibly go wrong? For a start, my slides aren't moving. Yes, they are. Okay. So in any emergency, physical problems need physical solutions, and no amount of talking will make them go away. And that is not to say that talking is not important. It is essential. But the focus of our conversations need to be on rapid actions rooted in the demands and the timeline of the physics, the chemistry, or the biology, rather than those of the politics. COVID has shown this, but it's also very true for the climate and ecological emergency. And ZCB aims basically to open up and build conversations which cross this chasm, exploring the net zero shift demanded by the climate science. Before we figure out where we need to end up, we need to take stock of where we are now, how much greenhouse gas emissions are we currently giving off, and where are they coming from? A lot of these figures you'll be very familiar with, I'm sure, so I'm not going to go into the detail of them. You'll get the picture from this figure. I want to move on and focus to what we can do about it. And ZCB research is kind of built on these two parallel principles of power down and power up. And I'm going to take you through those two principles in a little bit more detail. So by using a smart approach, we can deliver society's goals on a lot less energy. Annual energy demand to deliver key social goals is reduced by about 60% from the 2017 normal of approximately 1,670 terawatts per hour to around 680 terawatts per hour per year. And our energy breaks down into 4 key areas. That is the energy used by industry, all the appliances we use in buildings, heating space and water in buildings, and finally transport. So if we consider, if we begin by considering our traveling less and traveling differently, in our scenario, the distance traveled per person decreases by around 13% from 2017 levels as better communication tools to reduce the need for some journeys improves, as we see tonight. The fact that we're all here together, we've seen a huge shift in the way that that we share these kind of events since COVID. People walk and cycle more often, and we rethink public transport for the benefit of the citizen. When we do use cars, we can make better use of them by increasing the number of occupants once physical distancing allows, and these changes will ultimately reduce energy demand from transport. But just as importantly, they also create potentially more pleasant places to live and could actually make us healthier. So we start to see the co-benefits coming out of these different measures that we are suggesting we need to take. Buildings, here we see how in combination, the above measures that you can see here in this figure can reduce a building's space heating demand by around 60%. Again, there are multiple benefits. So for example, improved insulation can also help reduce the overheating of buildings in the summer by keeping the heat out rather than in. And going back to transport, I think my slides have got muddled. Reduction in energy used for transport in our scenario is shown in 2 stages. So firstly, by traveling less and traveling differently, and secondly, by higher efficiencies of light, smart electrical vehicles. So the number of miles flown for international aviation falls by approximately 2/3 in our scenario. In combination with efficiency improvements, this reduces aviation liquid fuel demand by about 75%. And total road and rail freight remains roughly the same to today's levels, but with rail freight more than doubling as around 30% of road freight switches over to rail. So that's the power down. The power up is the other element that I mentioned, and this section outlines how the UK can power up renewable energy sources to meet 100% of our powered down energy demand, reducing the emissions from our energy generation to zero. It's a transition to a new fuel mix from fossil fuels to 100% clean energy. The last fossil fuels that we should be using should be spent on kickstarting that transition. Then it becomes increasingly driven by renewables to power the fabrication of more renewables until we have all the energy that we need to run a powered down Britain. One of the most common questions we get asked at CAP, particularly when we give this presentation or one similar, is can we really keep the lights on with 100% renewables? Our Power Up model outlines basically how, if you get the right mix at the right locations and the right backups, renewable energy sources can indeed meet 100% of the UK's powered down energy demand 100% of the time, whilst also reducing emissions from our energy production down to zero. And I'm going to explore that a little bit further very, very quickly. Apologies for really whizzing through these. We'll start with wind. So the position of the British Isles as Europe's wild and windy western fringe gives us one of the best wind power resources in the world. What's more, wind power has the advantage that statistically wind speeds are stronger during the winter season, when energy demand is, of course, at its highest. So this doesn't mean that the wind always blows when we need energy. It doesn't always do what we want it to do, but it does show why wind power can help to meet a significant proportion of our energy demand. The position of the British, oh, sorry, I've done that. I have lost my place. It's not moving on. Okay, so even though our variable energy demand and our chosen variable energy supply are quite well matched over the seasons, they don't necessarily completely match up perfectly, resulting in what we call peaks and troughs. So we adjusted the mix and the location to minimize those, but to keep the grid voltage and frequency stable and secure. Dealing with the peaks is essentially as complicated as dealing with the troughs. We can export around half of the peaks, and then we use the surplus electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen by electrolysis, and by upgrading the hydrogen to synthetic carbon neutral methane and liquid fuels, we can rescue our existing gas grid, gas stores, gas power stations, and assets. So the gas industry effectively becomes part of our solution, but with a different type of gas and approximately 4 times the storage, or double what we had a few years ago. Same for some of the liquid fuels. So the amount of biomass that we burn is relatively small. Most of it's used to upgrade hydrogen from surplus renewables to synthetic methane and liquid fuels. So the surplus energy from the peaks in renewable generation can be stored and used by the existing gas infrastructure. So can we achieve that 100%? Well, yes, we can, and we can do it with the existing technology, but it is going to require us to rethink our land use. And I'm going to talk very quickly about that next. So at CAT, we've mapped out the whole of the UK into 1 million hectare blocks. Just over 6% of that land is classified as urban areas, and you can see that marked in the bottom left-hand corner in grey. Over 2/3 of our land in the UK is dedicated to food production in some way, despite the fact that we currently import approximately 42% of what we eat. Almost 70% of agricultural land in the UK is to graze livestock for meat and dairy products, and half of our cropland is used to grow feed for those livestock. Only 12% of our land is currently covered in forest, with about 90% of that being harvested for timber. So we looked at diet, and we suggested an optimum ZCB diet based on the government's advice on the right proportions of different foods in the form of an NHS Eat Well guide. The inner circle that you can see is the Eat Well guide, the recommended guide, and the outer circle on the left that you can see is our average diet today, whilst the outer circle on the right that you see is our suggested ZCB diet. So no food need be completely off limits, but there is quite a shift in the way we eat. Switching to a healthier ZCB diet that I've just mapped out also frees up lots of land. We have the same amount of cropland, but a lot of it moves from feeding livestock to feeding us. And also this diet can feed us on a lot less grassland, so freeing up some of these pink squares for other uses. Other uses can include, for example, growing energy and making synthetic fuels. So the biomass in our model, in our scenario, is sustainable, UK managed, and most of it is not burned for energy, but to capture CO2 to upgrade stored hydrogen, energy from surplus renewables. And in total, the biomass produced from energy crops and waste is used to supply energy for the production of synthetic liquid fuels, biogas and synthetic gas, and heat. And we've still got some pink squares left. And for these, we looked at improving capturing carbon. And that is done essentially through doubling our UK forest area, increasing our use of wood products, and restoring 50% of UK's peatlands. So we can go from this that I showed you at the beginning, our current energy use, to this. Most importantly, our greenhouse gas emissions have decreased from 532 metric tons of carbon dioxide down to just 40 metric tons of carbon dioxide, a reduction of 92%. Our remaining impact on climate change is equivalent to 47 metric tons of carbon dioxide. This includes additional multiplier effects from aviation emissions, even with zero carbon fuel. Altogether, the changes to the way we use land, the increased area of forest, the restoration of 50% of our peatlands, and the use of more plant-based products allows us to capture that 47 metric tons of carbon dioxide. So this balances out the emissions left in our scenario, meaning that we capture the amount of greenhouse gases equivalent to our remaining impact every year. We've reached net zero. And that brings me to the end of your whistle-stop tour of rising to the climate emergency. I just very, very quickly, I think I've got about 30 seconds left, just tell you a little bit. The Hub and the Innovation Lab got introduced earlier. I'm doing a session on towards the end of this event, I think March the 20th, about a current innovation lab we're running with Staffordshire councils at the moment. It's all about understanding the barriers and supporting the stakeholders to implement their own systemic change, working with them to develop the interventions and the solutions needed to get to net zero. And that is it from me. Thank you.
Wow, Anna, thank you so much. There was that moment when you showed the graph at the end, when you said we go from this to this. I don't know if anybody else, but I just felt my heart, the sort of lift with great lightness and kind of delight at actually seeing that, seeing how it's possible, seeing the route map to that Zero Carbon Britain paint is just glorious. So thank you so much for sharing that. So I don't know about you, but I haven't had time to have any supper yet, but I feel like I'm absolutely stuffed with ideas and inspiration and different things that are running in my brain. It would be lovely to hear, having listened to each other, if there are things that you've heard in each other's presentations that have particularly moved you or touched you, or that you really disagreed with. It would be great to hear any reflections that the four of you might have on each other, any relatively concise reflections. Maybe we'll start with Michael, because Michael may need to disappear at some point. But Michael, any reflections on what you've heard so far from Sam and Lola and Anna?
Yeah, thanks. And I commented earlier on a little bit of what Lola and Sam had to say. I was struck by Anna's presentation. I think it's so important for us to see that there really is a path forward to, averting catastrophic climate change by scaling up existing renewable energy technology. And the reason it's important to recognize that, and Anna demonstrated how that's clearly true for the UK, but it's also true globally. And Mark Jacobson of Stanford, a more recent independent study by folks at UC Berkeley, have all demonstrated that there is a path to 80% renewable generated energy by 2035, 100% by 2050. Now, I have a book that is out that sort of really promotes that framing, that's the solution, scaling up existing technology. We don't need a miracle, Bill Gates. And the problem isn't technological. And we don't need technocratic solutions. We need socio-political solutions. Bill Gates has a book that came out around the same time. And he has argued that we can't get there from renewables alone. And in downplaying the role that renewables can play, he is forced to promote some pretty risky strategies, greater dependence on nuclear energy and the use of geoengineering, massive interference with the global environment in the hope that we can somehow offset the effects of increasing carbon pollution and global warming. what could possibly go wrong? That's really the message. It's a very dangerous path to go down. And so while I think it's great that Bill Gates is using his platform to draw attention to and create awareness about the climate crisis, I think that his prescription is not the right one. And we have to disabuse people of the notion that we can't get there by scaling up existing renewable energy technology, because if we accept that flawed premise, then once again, we're forced to contend with some really risky strategies for addressing the climate crisis.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. Lola, any reflections that you'd like to share on what we've heard from the other three here this evening?
Yeah, there's just so much, but I'll try and keep it brief. I really obviously related to what Sam was talking about, and I said that a bit in my responses to the questions. But in terms of Anna and Michael, I really agree with what Michael was saying about the kind of, I guess you could frame it as the limits of the doom narrative. And I feel like that's something which I've really thought about a lot over the last couple of years. As I kind of mentioned, the media has a particular way that it finds it easiest for it to frame us. And a lot of that kind of leans very heavily into the emergency aspect. And it leans a lot into the time is running out, and there's not a lot that we can do. But I think that it's really interesting to think about what that prompts us to do and the way that prompts us to respond. I think that fear is a motivator, but it's a dangerous one. And I think that we have to be careful about what inclinations that prompts in people. I mentioned a bit earlier the fact that diversity was a big issue for the movement. And I think that when you're so stuck in, time is running out, there's only a certain amount of time you have left to do things, suddenly a lot of different solutions start to seem like they could work. And so you're jumping from, this thing to another thing. You're saying, oh, we don't have time to deal with diversity. We don't have time to think about the global south. We don't have time to think about equality and fairness. We just have to get the emissions down, kind of thing. And that is, I think, a very dangerous way to approach to kind of take. And I think that a lot of people that promote that speak in this kind of way are well-meaning, but they don't always see how the narrative that they're using can be weaponized and can be taken by people that aren't as well-meaning as them, or that have different inclinations and can be spun in a direction that is really dangerous. I think that, we have a society where there are a lot of people who are quite reactionary. And I think that, if we're going to go down this particular direction, we can't expect that, kind of as Michael was saying, we can't expect these people are going to stay in climate denial forever. Once they come round to the perspective that, climate change is real, it's here, and it becomes undeniable for them, it's become something they can't deny anymore, how are they going to use climate change to further their own agendas? And I think that the emergency, not the emergency narrative, but the doom and gloom narrative is one that is really, really useful to them, because then they can say, we need to shut the borders and focus on ourselves, because there's not enough time left and everything's going to shit, and we kind of just need to, there's nothing we can do, essentially. And that's something that I think we really need to resist. We need to be careful about how what we're saying can feed into that, because we're all fighting for justice, and that's quite clear. But not everyone is, and eventually they're gonna cotton on to what's going on, and things could get a bit ugly. So yeah, there's so much more I could say, but I think I'll leave it there.
And we would love to hear it all, but another time perhaps we'll. So, Sam, what would be your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, building on that actually, what Michael and Lola have said about how it's no longer just good enough to talk about climate change, and you know, Michael elaborated on the various forms of sort of climate denial that are beginning to emerge, and climate delay as well, and those things are a huge problem. And I just like add to that is that we're also seeing the emergence, or rather re-emergence, of other ecologies that are, you know, that we have to take at face value. These are people who would call themselves environmentalists. They just have a different politics to what might be our politics. So I'm including in that sort of various right-wing ecologies. And there's a long history of this that we can trace back for decades. I mean, in the Nazi Party, there were many people who considered themselves environmentalists. And there's a sort of fascinating study of this done by Janet Beal called Ecofascism Revisited, which pinpoints the various sort of depoliticized movements that were talking about ecological and environmental issues at the time, and argues that because these movements were depoliticized, because they were refusing to talk about politics, to spell out their own positive vision of the future, it allowed for a sort of far-right imaginary to assume that space. And I think that's what we need to really sort of understand the threat that we're up against now, is that it's no longer good enough just to call for that green revolution. I mean, to just give you an example, in the last couple of weeks, you know, we saw the Daily Express launch a big campaign for the green revolution, and this was supported by Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and WWF, all the big climate think tanks. The Daily Express, I mean, the UN has called the Daily Express a publication that perpetuates hate speech. The anti-migrant agenda of that paper is very well documented, and the campaign itself was wrapped up in this eco-nationalist, eco-capitalist framing, which we should be having nothing to do with. That should not be a part of ecological politics at all, because not only is it not going to solve the climate crisis, but it is absolutely not the kind of just, fair, equal society that we want to see. And so I think that's a really important shift that we need to start talking about. Okay, we've won the debate. Yeah, climate change is real. Now we've got these bigger fights to fight. And we can take a moment and we can pat ourselves on the back for achieving step one. But we've got a lot left to oppose, and a lot more thinking to be done, and a lot more envisioning and imagination to come. And I think that's the real exciting opportunity of it, because, okay, there's sort of one way in which we all put on somber faces and talk about the Nazis, but, you know, the other side of that coin is, okay, here's the opportunity. We have a moment here to spell out a beautiful, wonderful, just future. And if we can imagine that together, it's like, sure, we have to rewild the world, but first let's rewild like our imaginations, let's rewild our understanding of what politics and society is. And if we can spell out a just vision of that, then I think that's how we counter these narratives of doom and delay that Michael and Lola are talking about.
Amen to that. Thank you. And also just to thank you so much for the article that you wrote challenging the Daily Express thing. And if people haven't seen Sam's piece, it was a beautiful dismantling of the idea that somehow the Daily Express is now our great green hope for the future. Anna, any reflections that you would have on what you've heard from our three other wonderful speakers here this evening?
Yeah, I think there was a couple of things that really stood out for me, and actually by the time I'd heard all three, I realized there was a kind of common thread in a way, and it was this this kind of description of a slight, almost a contradiction or a juxtaposition. So Sam talked about the high, the feeling of a high of success, followed by this feeling of failure, and Lola they both talked about the fractures in the movements and some of the, you know, it really struck me, Lola saying, we thought we were all there, you know, for the same reason, and it turned out we weren't. And then Michael talked about this kind of agency and urgency alongside each other. And that really struck me, and it made me think about kind of the many years that I've spent in this movement. Oh, facing some of those feelings and some of those experiences, particularly that sense of, oh my God, this is it, we're going to save the world, followed by a sense of that doom of we're all screwed. You know, I mean, I really have gone through multiple cycles of that. And it made me think about the innovation lab process that we run, where we expect to fail. In an innovation lab process, you're prototyping all the time. You're looking for solutions. We don't ever expect all of those solutions are going to work. And I think that there's something really important for all of us in that, in terms of learning from all those different emotions when it feels like it's failing. I thought, Sam, you did a really good analysis of why elements of Extinction Rebellion weren't working. And it all comes back around to democracy. And that's something that I'm particularly interested in, and is how we as a society work better together to address the climate emergency. And I feel that there is so much to offer. It concerns me that there's a lot of duplication out there. And I know that part of this summit is about how can we be better together. So I think that was kind of key things that jumped out for me.
Thank you. Nick, are you picking up from here, or are you having headphone trouble, my friend?
I was having headphone trouble, so I've discarded them. Thank you so much. Thank you all. My gosh, what a feast, as Rob said earlier on. And you know, again, I've written so many notes. You know, we could carry on forever, but I won't go on about them. Of course, just to pick up that what Lola said, and just, you know, and that kind of echoes Martin Luther King: injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We need to, whilst we're keeping our eye on intergenerational justice, we also have to keep an eye on intragenerational justice. That is key. And also, of course, the points about eco-modernism, which is making strong headways into solutions thinking. We need to try and sort of combat that, because yes, you know, it is really about social political solutions, not just technocratic solutions, as Michael told us. If I may start with a semi-provocative question that Helen from Transition Burlington posted earlier on, which is that are movements like Transition and other community people-led movements the quiet revolution, or a quiet revolution, the one that we need? So if I can perhaps ask you first, Sam, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think in a way, I think if they are, you need a theory of revolution, right? Which many of these movements do. The slightly bizarre graph that I showed everyone earlier tries to define success and failure in various different ways. And one of those is collective potential. So it's like utopian dreaming. And that's a success that can come out of a movement. One of it is burnout, which is a form of failure. One of it is culture, which is about how we're impacting stuff now. And one of it is gains, in terms of the sort of stuff that we might refer to as this is a sort of tangible success that we can point towards in a sort of policy term. And absolutely, those kind of quiet revolutions are particularly good for building culture and also unlocking the field of utopian desire, sort of utopian hope, which I think Ernst Bloch calls it. And I think a lot of these movements share that in common, and a lot of the strategies rely on emphasizing different points in that. I think in the introduction to This Is Not a Drill, which is the Extinction Rebellion handbook, I think I call Extinction Rebellion a quiet revolution too, because in many ways that prefigurative politics, which you see in social movements, has a lot to do with the sort of social movements similar to transition towns. So yeah, I'll keep it short. There's so much more we could say on that.
Ah, my gosh, indeed, there is so much more. And anyway, I'm not going to even reflect on that because we don't have much time. Brother Rob?
Well, we were going to hear from Anna and...
Yes, I beg your pardon. I'm so sorry, Anna and Lola. Please. Anna, do you want to go first? Do you want the question again?
Yes, sorry. Still, after a year, still forgetting to press unmute. Yes, I agree. I agree with a lot of what Sam just said. I'm just trying to read the question again quickly now. I mean, for me, I think that the thing about a lot of these movements and what's happened, particularly over the last couple of years, there's been a bit of a perfect storm of these different movements really coming out in force. And whether it's the quiet revolution or the loud revolution, you know, there's been something about the timing. There's been a kind of critical mass over the last couple of years, and that's been quite incredible. And I'm a firm believer that there is a place for all of those movements, quiet and loud, the social science and the science. And what we need to do is be kind of encouraging them to work together and alongside each other. There you go. Very succinct answer.
Thank you so much, Anna. And that leads perfectly to pose the question to Lola, who has, you know, talked a lot about the justice elements, you know, of the climate movement, of the environmental movement. And I think in many ways, the justice side has been divorced from the sustainability side, and that is why we are not succeeding as yet. And it's so frustrating. What do you think, Lola?
I think that is really interesting, like, especially as a young person, you do see like a divide in terms of the types of action. And I feel like, you know, I don't know if I have the answers for like how we bridge that. I feel like a movement like the climate strikes has really been a way to do that, because as I said, like, we brought together pretty much, if you think about climate or sustainability on these issues, then it would bring you together. But I think that then there's the work of like, when we bring people into a movement, then that like initial work of establishing where we're at and what types of different, as I think was mentioned earlier, like what different issues people work on, where do people fit in terms of their skills and their interests and what they like gravitate towards. And I think we need to be able to understand that, I don't know, to not expect that one group is supposed to do everything, and to understand that like this movement works not because of any particular group, but because we have all these different groups that are working on different things at the same time. And like, really, it's not really necessarily about like, you know, forcing everyone to work on one particular thing or see it in a particular way, but understanding that you need the different levels and like types of action, and that as long as we're all, I guess, as long as we're all fighting for a future which is fair, and you know, oh my god, I feel like there's just no time. So as long as we're all fighting for a fair future, then like that's really it, I guess. I don't know if that really addressed the question, but there you go.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think we're gonna squeeze one more question in because we can, and because you're all wonderful. And one of the questions that feels very timely, and I know that many of the different organizations and activists who are here with us this evening are currently really thinking about this, is what are the most important messages we need to give to COP26 as grassroots organizations and as individuals? How should we be mobilizing to have an influence to impact on the conversations that happen at COP? Anna?
I think for me, it builds on what Lola was just talking about, that the most important message is, well, actually there's two. One is the figures, the science, the 1.5 degrees. You know, we are still warming, the planet is warming too quickly to higher degrees. So that's one, is really reminding them that we've made a commitment to that through the Paris Agreement and building on that. But the other is about the just transition to net zero, that it cannot be a transition at any cost. It absolutely has to be a just transition.
Beautiful, thank you. Sam?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's probably going to be all of our answers, is holding people to targets, getting those targets absolutely in stone, in black and white. The just transition, baking climate justice into things. Climate debt is going to be really important. climate finance. We need to progress conversations on both of those things. And then, you know, from a kind of selfish movement point of view, I'm also hoping COP26 is a moment where movements can coalesce and work together, and we can see coalitions beginning to form, because for too long, the environmental movement and the radical movement and the left movement more generally has been split, and we need to start developing and cohering ideas of coalition building. And I think COP is a fantastic opportunity for that.
Beautiful. And Lola, last word to you.
Yeah, totally agree with everything that's just been said. I also feel like this really is it's an opportunity for us, a really big opportunity for us to lay out our vision in a positive way. And I also feel like it's, you know, I really feel like this touches on what Michael was saying earlier in terms of like technological fixes and these types of things. I feel like this really is a moment where we need to say, like, we have the solutions now and we need to implement them. This isn't about, you know, especially with our government, you know, this isn't about funding future technologies which will, like, hopefully someday from now give us the solutions we need. Like, no, you know, we have what we need right now and we need to implement it. And I think that really honing in on that, because their messaging is in the run-up to COP is really about trying to paint themselves, a government trying to paint themselves as climate leaders and as global leaders in this sense. And I feel like reminding people that actually they're chatting a load of nonsense, and we have the solutions and they're choosing to ignore them, is something that we can really use this year as something to highlight and to basically just shame them on the global stage. So yeah.
Thank you. So before we draw our fantastic evening to a close, I'm just going to hand over to Fanny to share her visual note-taking for this evening. So you are in for a visual treat. Fanny, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen with you. So during this meeting, I was live drawing the essence of the conversation, or I hope I did, and I will show you a bit the process. So it has been so rich. Can you see something? Yeah?
Can you make it full screen?
Oh.
Perfect.
Yeah, we had the opportunity to get a big picture of the climate emergency, reflect on success and failure, rethink our privilege, and thinking systematically. We understood a bit more the climate emergency, but especially we got a lot of hope. So thanks a lot for this moment, and it was brilliant.
Thank you. Beautiful. So Fanny's beautiful picture from today and from yesterday will go on all of our social media places and onto the Losing Control platform as well. So thank you so much for being part of this evening, everybody. I think this has been pretty incredible. It's been filmed and will be shared soon on YouTube. So do spread it around to anyone you feel might have enjoyed it. And we really hope that you're going to be able to make as much of the What Next Summit as possible, to really throw yourself into it, and that we will see you again soon in many of the sessions.